Malal is a weird entity in Warhammer Fantasy, mostly because while he's a fan favorite part of the lore, filling in a niche of the setting that I'll explain later, there isn't much lore about him. This is for good reason, which I'll also explain later. What I'm more interested in for the video is his color scheme, the black and white quarter color pattern. Mostly because both those colors are a bit difficult to pull off alright, especially for new painters. Don't consider this a tutorial, but more of me just exploring this color scheme. I've already experimented a little bit, so we'll see how things go. Black and white are two very difficult colors to paint for multiple reasons. White is difficult because the pigments tend to be a bit chalky once the paint dries, so it's easy to clog up detail. A good way to get around this is watering down your white paint a lot more than other paints, which makes the coverage really fucking bad. Luckily, some companies have made pretty good white paints recently, like Monument Hobby's Bold Titanium White and Two Thin Coat's White Star. So this isn't as much of a problem if you get those paints, although still probably water those paints down a bit if you can. Another problem is actually similar to the problem black has, where it's a bit tricky to have contrast, since they're the lightest and darkest colors you can go for. A smart way to tackle this is obviously by starting with an off color, with an off-white or usually a really dark gray respectively. With this old Asgard Barbarian mini, I started with a half gray, half blue black base coat, which I then built up to a white and dark off gray color. While I am proud of him, I'm not big on what I did with the colors. The black came out a bit too bright and can read more as a gray, which is an easy trap someone can get into painting this color. I actually enjoyed what I did on this Dragon Ogre Shoggoth with their braces. It's more of a bone white and a subtle blue-gray. And keeping this theme of old models, I'm going to try that method out on this old monopose Chaos Warrior mini. Yeah, I got a bunch of these little guys on eBay. Gonna be my regular oldies since I kind of felt like I was missing that part of the army, the basic foot troop. Anyway, let's paint. I started off working on the white first, basing with a brown color. In this case, Muddy Brown by Reaper to line up the black primer. And personally, I think it looks good as a great undercoat for beige or similar colors. Gives it some depth. Speaking of which, the bone color that I'd be using for this is Morghast Brown. And this paint isn't great. It seemed to leave a very patchy finish, and I had to put multiple layers, which kind of ruined the whole brown undercoat. I haven't used this paint before this, and from my experience, I might not use this color again unless for highlights maybe. This was not a pleasant experience. Once I have that all base coated, I decided to work on the metallics, which I lost the footage for apparently. Here's how it all looked at the end. Sorry guys. Get used to that later on in the video. All the while doing some touch-ups here or there to make the lines look solid. Doesn't always pan out, but it works. Anyway, I applied this mystery paint I got at my LGS on the parts of the model that aren't black. I think it's Skeleton Horde because it's not as dark as Agrax Earthshade. Intense things a bit more light brown? I don't know how to word it. When that dries, I reapply the bone color. Once that's done, I touch up parts of the model where the colors are supposed to be separated. Since the bone paint spilled on parts of the model, I wanted to be black. I do it at this stage before highlighting the bone parts, both because if I did it after, it would be annoying to go back and clean up those parts, and reapplying the highlights. When that's taken care of, I start base coating with an off black color. I don't remember if this was either dark blue-gray by Vallejo or carbon gray from Reaper. Either way, I put on a slightly lighter dark gray color on top. Try not to give too much brightness to these parts of the model. To stretch the contrast a bit more, I mix my lightest gray with some of the bone white and just sprinkle it in here or there to add texture to the model, making it look a little dusty as if this guy just didn't care too much to wash his armor. At this part, I also decided to water down one of the dark grays to a wash consistency for the chainmail. Why not use a wash? I don't like the look of it, honestly. Now done with the black, I apply H-Bone by Reaper, and then mix in a smidge of Pro Acryl's Bold Titanium White to make these parts of the model lean more into the white. After this, I just had to paint the axe handle red, base coating with a darker red and then a lighter red on the higher areas. This part was rather minor, so I just didn't want to put too much effort into it, honestly. I seem to have lost the footage applying the bright red, and also how I painted the base before I added the effects. I believe I wanted a hue contrast, with parts of the base being a reddish brown, and then other parts being a very light blue, just to make things interesting in case the effects don't cover them up. I never explained how I did the basing for my Chaos Army. Well, since most of the Chaos Warriors come from the north or south, I wanted to do a snowy base, but show they are traveling a little ways away from the colder climates, with the undergrowth popping out here or there. Also, because it's Chaos, a whole lot of blood effects with blood for the blood god. Makes things pop out a bit. While we wait for the basing materials to dry, let me tell you about why we don't hear much about Malal in Warhammer Fantasy outside of the community. He was introduced in the early years of Warhammer Fantasy when the Chaos faction of the game was developing, and was never seen again because of legal issues. You see, Malal was showcased in a comic made by the writing duo Joe Wagner and Alan Grant, and drawn by Brent Ewan. You might know their work in the 2000 AD comics in the UK where Judge Dredd calls home. In fact, Joe Wagner was the co-creator of that character. GW had a good relationship with 2000 AD, with GW making various board games of their properties, which later on influenced Warhammer 40k, and even some board games made by GW at the time were drawn by these artists. So it's no surprise that when it came time for GW to flesh out the world of Warhammer Fantasy, they'd get the 2000 AD guys to produce material for them. Whether because of it not being discussed during the contracting phase or some other factor outside my knowledge, GW never made it clear that this was a work-for-hire gig. Oh boy, I get to hyperfixate about comic books. Let's go! In comic books, when a writer or artist makes something for a publisher, it's generally specified that whatever they make is owned by that publisher. Work for hire has historically been a good way to screw the creative talent in comic books, with publishers not even giving royalties or even recognition for a creative's work unless you knew a lawyer. Famously, the creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, never saw a cent of royalties for the character until the first movies came out because of this practice. Things are a bit better now, with artists and writers getting some royalties whenever their contributions get adapted to film and such. This type of contract exists in other artistic jobs, but it's just that the way it's used in comic books is more relevant to this topic. Because of this not being a part of the contract, John and Alan copyrighted the characters and were owned by them, meaning that if GW ever wanted to use them in, say, Realm of Chaos books to introduce the faction, GW would have to ask for their usage and pay the creatives, which isn't optimal for a business to do. So yeah, Malal just can't legally be used by GW in anything unless something slipped through the cracks. It's sad because I really like the vibe this Chaos God has. Just utter self-destruction and hatred. A nihilistic take on Chaos that I find interesting in the setting and doesn't get explored enough. I just think that Malal fills in the niche of a Chaos follower going full circle. That, after calling the name of the other Chaos gods to get what they want, finding themselves wanting him, and even possibly hating that they called for those powers to begin with. So they turn to Malal. Very Murkakian for the most part, honestly, if I'm not mistaken. Now, they did try to fill in Malal's niche with Nakoho, the god of unbelief, but it doesn't have the same vibe of self-hatred that emanates from Malal. I'm aware of Malice, by the way. 40k's equivalent, that's totally legally distinct, but that's 40k, and I consider that more of a descendant/adaptation of Malal, and I equally like it, but not relevant for fantasy for the most part. And I think the basing material has finished drawing, so let's see how it turned out. There are areas where I could have done better at blending, or adding a little bit more white in some areas because it looks a lot more beige than anything else. But honestly, I'm actually really happy with how this fella turned out. Not my best work, but not every model has to be that. Now he can march into battle with his Malal buds. Hopefully this was helpful, and if not, I hope you enjoyed the video either way.